Welcome. This is the 12th and final session of our study on Joshua and Judges. In this session, we will read chapters 19, 20, and 21, the final three chapters in the book of Judges. After the morally reprehensible actions and near anarchy we saw in the narrative of Micah and the Danites in session 11, we find that it can get worse. We will hear the horror story of the Concubine of Gibeah and of the ensuing civil war. And we will once again hear that in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. But first, a word of prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we've learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All history is created. Events transpire, but people tell and record, select and reshape them, creating historical texts. The nature of these texts varies widely, reflecting the interests and skills of their authors. Some retellings of the past attempt to depict the events as they transpired. Others cloak a particular ideology in historical garb, while still others aim primarily to enlighten or to entertain. These functions are not necessarily mutually exclusive. One person may compose an entertaining ideological text, or a text which was originally interested in the actual past may be reshaped by a later author with a didactic taste. These words are from the introduction of the creation of history in ancient Israel written by Marc Zvi Brettler. Over the 12 sessions of this study on the books of Joshua and Judges, the first volumes in a collection known as the Deuteronomic History, we have read and discussed a multitude of stories or narratives, some attempting to depict events as they transpired, some likely purely fictional. No one knows who the people were who wrote the stories in these books or who compiled, edited, or redacted them. There seems to be no clear consensus about who they were written for or when exactly they were put into their final forms. During the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE, during the early exile, or perhaps after the return from exile as late as the 5th century. But they purport to give us a history of Israel, to give the people of Israel, probably the people of Judah, a sense of who they were as a people, where they came from, and to whom they owe allegiance. The stories tell of Joshua leading the 12 tribes across the Jordan River to the Promised Land after the death of Moses, of the conquering or near conquering of Canaan, the division of the land among the 12 tribes. After the death of Joshua, we read that the Lord would periodically raise up judges to lead the people against their enemies. But we also learn that during the days of Moses, Israel was given laws to guide them. They were to follow the law, worship no God but the Lord, but Yahweh. They were to not intermarry with people that they found in the land they occupied. When Gideon, the judge called on by the Lord to lead the battle against the Midianites, was offered the role of king, he said, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." As time went on, they seemed to forget these laws, and they seemed to forget the Lord. In chapter 19, we read a story about a Levite who acquires a concubine in Bethlehem. So we begin with this chapter 19, verse 1. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite residing in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine became angry with him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for some 4 months. Then her husband set out after her to speak tenderly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. When he reached her father's house, the young woman's father saw him and came with joy to meet him. His father-in-law, the young woman's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank, and he stayed there. On the 4th day, they got up early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, "Fortify yourself with a bit of food, and after that you may go." So the 2 men sat and ate and drank together, and the young woman's father said to the man, "Why not spend the night and enjoy yourself?" When the man got up to go, his father-in-law kept urging him until he spent the night there again. On the fifth day, he got up very early in the morning to leave. And the young woman's father said, "Fortify yourself and linger until the day declines." So the two of them ate. When the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, "Look, the day is worn on until it is almost evening. Spend the night. See, the day is drawn to a close. Spend the night here and enjoy yourself. Tomorrow you can get up early in the morning for your journey and go home." We begin our story with a Levite, and knowing nothing else, it gives us an immediate and obvious link with the morally dubious Levite lad in the previous story, chapters 17 and 18. We're aware that from that story that hereditary connection with the Levite cult is clearly no guarantee of character. After the Levite followed the young woman back to her father's house, we are told the father-in-law rejoiced to greet him. The father seems to be smitten with the Levite to the exclusion of concern for his daughter. We also hear that the Levite had his lad or servant with him, as well as a couple of donkeys. So let's go on. But the man would not spend the night. He got up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Jebus, the day was far spent, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will continue on to Gibeah." Then he said to his servant, "Come, let us try to reach one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah, and went and sat down in the open square of the city, but no one took them in to spend the night. They avoid Jerusalem and the Jebusites and move on to Gibeah, where his fellow Israelites are expected to be more friendly. In verse 15, we are told that no one would take them in. This is the first signal of the allusions to the story of the visit of the two divine messengers to Sodom in Genesis 19. Well, let's go on to verse 16. Then at evening, there was an old man coming from his work in the field. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was residing in Gibeah. The people of the place were Benjamites. When the old man looked up and saw the wayfarer in the open square of the city, he said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" He answered him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to my home. Nobody has offered to take me in. We have straw and fodder for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and the woman and the young man along with us. Your servants need nothing more." The old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and fed the donkeys. They washed their feet and ate and drank. Pointedly, the sole person in Gibeah prepared to honor the civilized obligation of hospitality is not a Benjamite, but a man from the high country of Ephraim. The old man knows how dangerous it would be to spend the night outside in the square. Again, we see the parallels with the story of Lot and his two daughters in Genesis 19. So let's go on to verse 22. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house, so that we may have intercourse with him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them and do whatever you want to them. But against this man, do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and put her out to them. They wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. The line in verse 22, bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him, is an exact quote from Genesis 19:5, except that there were two men in the Genesis story. No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly in verse 23 is an exact quote from Genesis 19:8. The old man offers his daughter and the concubine, just as Lot had done with his daughters. It's hard to decide which is the most outrageous proposal, offering his daughter to be gang raped or his guest concubine over whom he has no jurisdiction. In the end, it is the Levite prepared to do anything to save his own skin who throws his concubine into the clutches of the rapists. In the end, the young woman appears to have expired, her arms stretching out across the threshold of the house where she might have been safe, her body sprawled on the ground before the house. Verse 27. In the morning, her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and when he went out to go on his way, there was the woman, his concubine, lying at the door of the house, with her hands on the threshold. Get up, he said to her, we are going. But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out for his home. When he had entered his house, he took a knife, and grasping his concubine, he cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Then he commanded the men whom he sent, saying, thus shall you say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day that the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt until this day? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out. We notice that only at the end of the story is he called repeatedly and almost ironically her master. At first he doesn't realize she is dead, but then he puts her on his donkey, and we may think he is going to give her a decent burial near his home. As the narrative is written, we don't even know for sure when she died, during the night, after being repeatedly raped, early in the morning, after he put her on the donkey, or when he begins to cut her up. When he cuts up her body, his intention is to trigger outrage over the atrocity that has been perpetrated in all the tribes. The number 12 is automatic here, but it would actually be 11 because Benjamin would be excluded. The Levite, until this point, has himself seemed lacking in outrage over the gang rape of his concubine. In 1 Samuel 11:7, we see a similar chopping up of oxen. Here, the Levite's butchering of her body completes the set of images of mutilation and other violence done to the body that began in the opening chapter of Judges with the chopping off of the thumbs and big toes of the captured king Adonibezek. We now go to chapter 20. The Levite from Ephraim intends to provoke a response from the tribes of Israel. He wants revenge sparked by outrage. So we go to chapter 20, verse 1. Then all the Israelites came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead, and the congregation assembled in one body before the Lord at Mizpah. The chiefs of all the people of all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of all the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers bearing arms. Now the Benjamites had heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah, and the Israelites said, tell us, how did this criminal act come about? The Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered, I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to spend the night. The lords of Gibeah rose up against me and surrounded the house that night. They intended to kill me, and they raped my concubine until she died. Then I took my concubine and cut her into pieces and sent her throughout the whole extent of Israel's territory, for they have committed a vile outrage in Israel. So now you Israelites, all of you, give your advice and counsel here. Verse 2 says 400,000 soldiers. The military numbers in all these stories are exaggerated, but this is especially fantastic. At no time in the history of ancient Israel could the nation have deployed this large an army. In his explanation, the Levite says the men of Gibeah wanted to kill him. They actually wanted to have sex with him. He says nothing about the fact that he himself thrust the concubine out the door into the hands of the rapists. He asked for advice and counsel, but we know that what he really wanted was vengeance. Go on to verse 8. All the people got up as one, saying, "We will not any of us go to our tents, nor will any of us return to our houses. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. We will take 10 men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000, to bring provisions for the troops who will go to repay Gibeah of Benjamin for all the disgrace that they have done in Israel." So all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one. The tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin. "What crime is this that has been committed among you? Now then, hand over those scoundrels in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel." But the Benjamites would not listen to their kinfolk, the Israelites. The Benjamites came together out of the towns of Gibeah to go out to battle against the Israelites. On that day, the Benjamites mustered 26,000 armed men from their own towns, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 picked men. Of all this force, there were 700 picked men who were left-handed. Every one could sling a stone at a hare and not miss. And the Israelites, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 armed men, all of them warriors. 10% of the assembled troops are to provide logistical support for the warriors. The Israelites at first sought to punish only the perpetrators of the murderous sex crime. The refusal of the Benjamites to hand them over sets the stage for the bloody civil war. We may recall that the Benjamite Uhud used his left hand to take Elgon by surprise. Here we are told that the Benjamites mustered 700 left-handed men. Perhaps that was a trait common among the men of Benjamin. We go on to verse 18. The Israelites proceeded to go up to Bethel, where they inquired of God, "Which of us shall go up first to battle against the Benjamites?" And the Lord answered, "Judah shall go up first." Then the Israelites got up in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. The Israelites went out to battle against Benjamin, and the Israelites drew up the battle line against them at Gibeah. The Benjamites came out of Gibeah and struck down that day 22,000 of the Israelites. The Israelites went up and wept before the Lord until the evening, and they inquired of the Lord, "Shall we again draw near to battle against the kinfolk, the Benjamites?" And the Lord said, "Go up against them." The Israelites strengthened themselves and again formed the battle line in the same place where they had formed it on the first day. In verse 18, the Israelites asked God, "Who shall go up first against the Benjamites?" If you remember, in the first verse of chapter 1, the Lord said, "Judah shall go up first against the Canaanites." Now the Benjamites are the enemy, but it is still Judah who shall go up first. The Israelites seem to have already made up their minds to do battle with Benjamin without consulting God. Their only question is about who should go first. We also notice that there is no request for guidance on about how to conduct the battle. Again, in verse 23, the Lord says, "Go up against them," but still no strategy advice. Let's go on to verse 24. So the Israelites advanced against the Benjamites the second day. Benjamin moved out against them in Gibeah the second day and struck down 18,000 of the Israelites, all of them armed men. Then all the Israelites, the whole army, went back to Bethel and wept, sitting there before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening. Then they offered burnt offerings and sacrifice of well-being before the Lord. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, "Shall we go out once more to battle against our kinfolk, the Benjamites, or shall we desist?" The Lord answered, "Go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand." Verse 27 refers to the Ark of the Covenant. This clause seems to be an editorial interpolation intended to explain to a later audience why the Israelites had come to Bethel to inquire of the oracle. If we add up all the time, all the judges we have read about judged Israel, assuming there's no overlap, it's hard to believe that Phinehas, who negotiated a settlement between the western and eastern tribes back in the days of Joshua, was still alive. But here he is, still at Bethel. So this episode follows a similar pattern to what we saw in the Delilah story. 3 repetitions with a reversal in the 3rd time. Let's go on. Verse 29. So Israel stationed men in ambush around Gibeah, and then the Israelites went up against the Benjamites on the 3rd day and set themselves in array against Gibeah as before. When the Benjamites went out against the army, they were drawn away from the city. As before, they began to inflict casualties on the troops along the main road, one of which goes up to Bethel and the other to Gibeah, as well as in the open country, killing about 30 men of Israel. The Benjamites thought they were being routed before us as previously. But the Israelites said, "Let us retreat and draw them away from the city toward the roads." The main body of the Israelites drew back its battle line to Bala Tamar, while those Israelites who were in ambush rushed out of the place west of Gibeah. There came against Gibeah 10,000 picked men out of all Israel, and the battle was fierce, but the Benjamites did not realize that disaster was close upon them. So the strategy used here is the same one that Joshua used against the town of Ai in Joshua 8. Many scholars think that the writer in Joshua drew inspiration from this story. So we go on. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the Israelites struck down 25,100 men of Benjamin that day, all of them armed. Then the Benjamites saw that they were defeated. The Israelites gave ground to Benjamin because they relied on the troops in ambush that they had stationed against Gibeah. The troops in ambush rushed quickly upon Gibeah. Then they put the whole city to the sword. Now the agreement between the main body of Israel and the men in ambush was that when they sent up a cloud of smoke out of the city, the main body of Israel should turn in battle. But Benjamin had begun to inflict casualties on the Israelites, killing about 30 of them. So they thought, surely they are defeated before us, as in the first battle. But when the cloud, a column of smoke, began to rise out of the city, the Benjamites looked behind them, and there was the whole city going up in smoke toward the sky. Then the main body of Israel turned, and the Benjamites were dismayed, for they saw the disaster was close upon them. Therefore, they turned away from the Israelites in the direction of the wilderness. But the battle overtook them, and those who came out of the city were striking them down in between. Surrounding the Benjamites, they pursued them from Nohah, and they trod them down as far as a place east of Gibeah. 18,000 Benjamites fell, all of them courageous fighters. When they turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, 5,000 of them were cut down on the main roads, and they were pursued as far as Gidom, and 2,000 of them were slain. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 arms-bearing men, all of them courageous fighters. But 600 turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and remained at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. Meanwhile, the Israelites turned back against the Benjamites and put them to the sword, the city, the people, the animals, and all that remained, also the remaining towns they set on fire. We read that 600 men stayed at the rock of Rimmon. It seems unlikely that this wilderness crag was either impregnable or invisible to the pursuing Israelites. So they may have made a decision to spare some remnant of the Benjamite fighting men. The language in verse 48 suggests that Gibeah and other Benjamite cities were put under the ban. Everyone there was killed. We go now to chapter 21, the concluding chapter in the book of Judges. Chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. Now the Israelites had sworn at Mizpah, "No one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin." And the people came to Bethel and sat there until evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. They said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, why has it come to pass that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel?" On the next day, the people got up early and built an altar there and offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of well-being. Then the Israelites said, "Who out of all the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly to the Lord?" For a solemn oath had been taken concerning whoever did not come up to the Lord at Mizpah, saying, "That one shall be put to death." But the Israelites had compassion for Benjamin, their kin, and said, "One tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters as wives? Now, after the victory, the people are confronted with a dilemma because of their binding vow not to give any of their daughters to Benjamites. The consequence will be elimination of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The second vow, to destroy whoever held back from joining in the war against Benjamin, will be used to find a way out of this first vow. We go to verse 8. Then they said, "Is there anyone from the tribes of Israel who did not come up to the Lord at Mizpah?" It turned out that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp, to the assembly. For when the roll was called among the people, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 soldiers there and commanded them, "Go put the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead to the sword, including the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman who has lain with a male you shall devote to destruction." And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had never slept with a man, and brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Jabesh Gilead is a northern territory to the east of the Jordan, which was allied with Benjamin, which will be clear in the story of Saul in 1 Samuel. Many scholars have inferred that the whole story of the civil war in the place of Jabesh Gilead in its aftermath is meant to discredit Benjamin, Saul's tribe. It's historically unlikely that the ban was practiced by one set of Israelites on another. It would have been a singularly bad solution to the dilemma of Benjamin's survival to achieve it by wiping out a whole group of Israelites, men, women, and children. Verse 12 says they brought them to Shiloh. The setting now shifts from Bethel to Shiloh, laying ground for the opening chapters of the book of Samuel, which are centered in Shiloh. Let's go to verse 13. Then the whole congregation sent word to the Benjamites who were at the rock of Rimmon and proclaimed peace to them. Benjamin returned at that time and they gave them the women whom they had saved alive of the women of Jabesh Gilead, but they did not suffice for them. They only had 400 young women for 600 men, so they hatched another plan. Let's go to verse 15. The people had compassion on Benjamin because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. So the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for wives of those who are left, since there are no women left in Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be heirs for the survivors of Benjamin in order for a tribe may not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give any of our daughters to them as wives, for the Israelites had sworn, 'Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to Benjamin.' So they said, 'Look, the yearly festival of the Lord is taking place at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and south of Lebanon.' And they instructed the Benjamites, saying, 'Go and lie in wait in the vineyards and watch, and when the young women of Shiloh come out to dance in the dance, then come out to the vineyards, and each of you carry off a wife for himself from the young women of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. Then if their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, Be generous and allow us to have them, because we did not capture in battle a wife for each man. But neither did you incur guilt by giving your daughters to them.' The Benjamites did so. They took wives for each of them from the dancers whom they abducted. Then they went and returned to their territory and rebuilt their towns and lived in them. So the Israelites departed from there at the time by the tribes and families, and they went out from there to their own territories." In all likelihood, the story of the delivery of 400 young women from Jabesh Gilead and the story of the snatching of the dancing girls in the vineyards are two different versions of how the surviving Benjamites got their brides that have been edited together, with a numerical deficiency introduced in the first story so that it can be made up in the second. What is involved at the vineyards is a kind of abduction, not rape, or perhaps a collective mating ceremony. In any case, the book of Judges, which begins in violence and is dominated by violence, ends here on an upbeat note with the dancing girls and the taking of brides. Go to the final verse, verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. This refrain is now inserted at the end. The state of political anarchy has been especially manifest in the story of the Concubine of Gibeah and the civil war that it triggers, and perhaps in the war's aftermath as well. The stage is now set for the book of Samuel, which will move quickly to the founding of the monarchy. Judges 19 shares several phrases with Sodom episode in Genesis 19. There is also a connection between the end of chapter 19 and the 1 Samuel 11:7. The question of who borrowed from who is not so obvious. It might be possible that they both borrowed from a third narrative, but it seems likely that Judges borrowed from the other two texts. One biblical scholar, Gail Yee, has suggested that stories of Judges 17 through 21 were written at the time of Josiah, the traditional date for the first edition of the Deuteronomistic history, and their goal was to consolidate Josiah's power and reform. The reform involved centralization of power. Part of that reform involved the loss of power by rural Levites, who are depicted so negatively in these last 5 chapters. Other scholars, for various reasons, suggest that the final redaction of Judges was sometime post-Josiah. Judges is constructed as a book with an introduction and a conclusion. The last 5 chapters, even though they do not involve Judges, are integral to and integrated into the rest of the book. Judges may be considered a group of traditions that were smoothed together to create this book. The significance of the pro-Judean theme is clarified in the conclusion, which dovetails with what we saw in the introduction. Its explicit theme of the final 5 chapters is kingship, as emphasized in the refrain. In those days there was no king in Israel. The implied references to Saul anchor that theme. The episode of Othniel, the judge who defeats the double wickedness in chapter 3, was created as a model of an ambiguously positive Judean leader. The final judges are just the opposite of Othniel and Uhud. This is particularly clear for Samson, where it is suggested that he has broken all of his Nazirite vows, comes into contact with corpses, drinks intoxicants, becomes involved with foreign women, and finally cuts his hair. According to Brettler, Judges is not a book of history in the sense of a work interested in a real past, nor is it a work of literature. Instead, it is a highly political work which echoes the sentiment found in 1 Kings 1:31, "May my Lord King David live forever." In this study on the books of Joshua and Judges, we have primarily used the works of Thomas B. Dozeman, Richard D. Nelson, Robert Alter, Robert Polzin, and Marc Zvi Brettler. While I have attempted to convey their ideas accurately, undoubtedly some of my interpretations were better than others, nor did I identify my exact source for everything I said in this study. Be clear, this is a church Bible study, not an academic paper. If you want to know exactly what these sources said, you will need to read their books. I hope these sessions have been useful in the understanding of the books of Joshua and Judges. As always, I appreciate any comments or concerns you may wish to offer. I hope you can join us in our discussion Monday evening. If you need to, send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org to get the Zoom link. Have a good week.